In this video, I'm going to teach you how to study smarter and not necessarily harder. I'm going to teach you the most scientifically proven ways of study tactics and tips that I use through college and medical school. Going through school was a challenge for me, and trying to learn the best study tactics was a challenge because I tried a lot of different things. And having ADHD and dyslexia didn't make it any easier, but I would spend hours and hours going to the library trying to look and read and listen to as many tapes as possible to find the best study tactics to use so that I can implement so I can improve my grades, improve my testing scores. And I did find on the way, different ways that actually worked helpful for me as I was going through college and medical school. And I want to save you time so that you can use these methods and not waste time, because these are scientifically proven ways to help improve, retain information, and to be able to be more successful in school. So I'm going to talk about 6 different methods that I found beneficial for me that I personally have used and are proven for not just myself but for others. But the very first one that I want to share with you is what they call is the SQR3. So it stands for survey, question, and then the 3 R's is to read, recite, and then review. So let me explain how I did that. So anytime I would go into lecture or anytime I had to read a big textbook, we've all had those big textbooks that we have to read, and it can be very daunting. And so what you have to do is specifically, and let me just pull out a textbook. This is my old textbook, Pharmacology, that I had to study in medical school. And you can see that there is a lot to read, right? Lots of material, lots of stuff. And typically people are going to just passively just read through the chapter, and that is the wrong way to do it. Even they'll try to use highlighting. And yes, highlighting can be helpful, but sometimes that's still very passive. So to use the SQ3R method is first you want to survey the chapter. So what I would do is basically look through the chapter and really speed read through it, mainly just kind of skimming through it. You're looking at basically the bolded areas, the headings, you're looking at diagrams that are here, you're looking at all this information and just getting an idea of what the whole chapter is about. But at the same time, which leads to the second thing, is questions. You're asking yourself questions of what questions that you do have in this chapter. And you're also gathering information of what you already know possibly of this chapter. The same thing applies when you're going into lecture. So when you're in lecture, you're going to want to read the notes. So, we all get slides. I don't know if you guys still do today, but you get a lot of slides and you want to really glim and skim over this and have questions before you have your lecture. And then you're going to ask those questions to your teacher. Then it goes to the 3 R's. First R is read. So you're going to read, you're going to go back and you're actually going to read, and you're going to try to answer those questions that you do have. But also in lecture, you're going to have those questions answered by your teacher. So same kind of concept within lecture or if you're reading the material yourself. And then the second R is, of course, recite. So after you've had the lecture or after you've read it for the first time, is you're going to try to recite the information that you just read. Make sure if it made sense to you, you can even recite it to somebody else. And then the third is to review that material. So review after you've gone to that lecture or after you've read, you want to review it by going over it again. Now, there's definitely a better way of simply just reading it. What I'm going to share with the next steps as far as how to actually review this material so it actually does solidify. It's what had helped me with my success through college and medical school. So the very first one is mind maps. Now, if you're not familiar with mind maps was a godsend for me because it's very visual. So just to give you an idea of an old note of mine right here, this is nutrition treatment for hypothyroidism. Basic concept of mind maps is really kind of using a central concept. So I drew a thyroid, right? So this is for hypothyroidism. Then it branches out to other key concepts. You use arrows, you use other pictures, and you use bullet points that are the most important key elements with what you are reviewing. So when you are reviewing material, right, you're reading in the textbook, you want to try to do some mind maps when you're reviewing. Especially if you're looking at your lecture notes, whatever you wrote, especially if you answer those questions, you're going to create those mind maps based off of that material. And that's a good way to use the review process of the 3 R's. People don't take this a step further. I actually use this concept and something I haven't really seen, but you should be creating a mind map really for every chapter you review, every lecture that you review. But when it comes to a final exam or midterms or any kind of exam, you're going to have several of these, 8, 10, however it might be, but you need to look at patterns. And how you do that is you want to have a big cork board. Now, I was a poor college student. I couldn't afford a big cork board. So I'm going to share with you what I did use. I tried to recreate it. So just give me a second here. And voila! I had to use cardboard, right? Because I couldn't afford a cork board, so I would just use recycled cardboard. And I'd make this. This is the best replica. It's kind of falling apart. It's kind of tilting, but Work with me here. So basically what you're trying to do is you're taking these mind maps, and you can see how I placed them all right here, right? So you could see them all together, right? Sometimes before I even had the board, before I even thought about, using cardboard, I'd lay it all on the floor so I could see all of my mind maps together, because the idea on this is you're trying to look for patterns, right? So you're going to look at this material and you're looking, okay, what are some similarities within all these mind maps? Then you make connection. This is just some concepts from, medications that I had to learn about each body, but you look at some similarities and patterns. And then, of course, in the center, you probably use another blank sheet to be able to create another mind map that connects all of these mind maps. Because what's happening when you take that exam, you want to be able to really recall information really quickly, but also challenging yourself when you're creating these mind maps and creating connections, because your teachers are going to try to create really difficult questions. And when you can really solidify and understand the concept, you'll think about these mind maps. You'll start visualizing it. And in fact, they look like branch chained connections of neurons connecting together. And that's why these mind maps work so effectively, and they work so effectively for me. Okay, back to it. Now, the third thing that I would say it's really important that I found when I was using mind maps, sometimes there's huge lists that sometimes I need a little bit more detailed information, and to be able to test myself by using active recall. So active recall is definitely a method that is proven to be able to be a smart way to be able to help improve your long-term memory and to be able to retain the information better. So this is definitely a smart way. Instead of trying to study hard, trying to just passively look at your notes, it is going to be a smart method. So when it comes to flashcards, now I couldn't find the ones that I created, but here are these ones. Basically, the idea is as you're going through the flashcards, so let's say it's a list and you're going through them, what you need to first initially do is you need to group ones that have similar things, right? Are you starting to see a trend here? Same with mind maps. You're trying to find ways you can group things. These 10 are similar, these 5 are similar, and then you memorize those by the groups. So it's either to batch it that way so that it's easier to recall that information. But taking another step further, after you've memorized each one of those, you want to mix them all again. And then every time you see that card, you're thinking about that group and how they're similar. And then maybe you mix it again and group it in a different way. Because for me, I always had to study different interactions when it came to nutrients, when it came to drugs. And when we're thinking about, patients and stuff like that, there's so many things that can happen in the body that we have to think of all these different scenarios. So I would remix the cards and think about, okay, well, how about we group it this way? How about we group it this way? Because I know my teacher is going to ask these difficult questions. And so you got to think about that. In fact, ask your teacher how he would ask questions. And so this will help you really stimulate the process to be able to study smarter versus harder. The fourth thing that is so critical is spaced repetition. So when you are studying, you don't want to just be cramming all at night. I used to do that sometimes, would procrastinate, but I learned early on, especially in college, that I had to space it out. So when I would study either my flashcards or, my mind maps, when I'm looking at my notes, stuff like that, I'm going to be able to use the active recall process. So maybe day 1, I study these flashcards, and day 1, I redraw these mind maps and to be able to actively recall it. And then I have a group of cards that I'm like, okay, I need to study a little bit more on these. So I'll study it the next day. Whereas the other group, maybe I'll study in 3 days and then in a week and so forth, because eventually it's been about a month and then I can still recall that information because of how I spaced it out. And that is the best way to do that. And especially they have been proven scientifically to use spaced repetition. Now, the fifth way that is going to be really important when you are using all these different ways, when you're using mind maps, flashcards, spaced repetition, and of course, how we talked about the SQ3R process, is that you got to use a way to be able to understand if you understand the information. So how you do that is you do practice tests. Now, we talked about flashcards. That's kind of a way. In fact, instead of you just passively looking at the cards like, oh, I think I know this answer, and you flip and you're like, oh yeah, of course I did. Instead of flipping it right away, get a blank piece of paper and write it down before you look at the answer. That is a way to kind of use practice tests, but what I would highly recommend is go to the library and look at your subjects, see if you can find any books that have practice tests. So for me, I would get a lot of these different books. This one was on embryology. I actually bought some of these books, and they would have practice tests. And you would find sometimes your teachers would use these exact questions. Now, it really depends, but by doing this is at least a way to practice to see if you know what you know. And then on top of that, what you do is just maybe ask other senior, people who have taken the exam or have already taken the class, ask if they have any old tests that you could look at and go over, or better yet, ask your teacher if they have, tests from last year that they've used, and they are more willing that will actually give you those so you can actually practice. Just say, hey, I want to practice, make sure I do good, and they'll give you that information. So it's always using practice tests so that you know that you actually got it versus, freaking out on the exam. So by the time you get to the exam, you've already had some experience, you've already practiced that, and that helps you retain the information. Now, I found this the most benefited way to be able to really solidify the information, and that is by teaching others. Now, I wish I used this information really early on in my college years. I didn't do it until about midway through college, and then I certainly applied it in medical school. But we had a lot of information that we had to learn. And when we went through the whole process, once you gather all the information, it's important to teach it to somebody. Why? Because if you could teach it to someone, especially if you could simplify it, then you really know the information. But not only that, it helps you practice to understand if you know it, or if you've kind of missed some concepts, you can really catch that when you're teaching it to somebody else. But also, when you are teaching somebody, you're using all your senses. And when you're using all your senses, it also helps retain the information. But even more importantly, when you're studying with other smarter people, when I would do that, when I studied with smarter people than me, they would catch things. They're like, well, that's not how I understood it. And they would correct me. I'm like, oh, thank you so much, because I would have gotten that question wrong on the test. So it's really important to be able to do this. And I usually would do this at the end of my studying, right before an exam, maybe a couple days. And I would keep your study group sessions, probably maybe about 3, no more than 4 people, because when it's more than 4, ends up being a party. So you got to find people that are more dedicated and don't make your groups too big, otherwise it becomes ineffective. The other thing that's also really critical is be able to study for a long amount of time productively. We get distracted really easily, and you might have to study for 10+ hours. So you might be wondering, how do I actually do that? Well, watch this video right here where I show you how I was able to study 10 productive hours a day when I needed to when I was in medical school. So watch this video right here. I'll see you there.